Isle of Wren, Virginia, October 14, 1839. In less than 24 hours, 55 people lay dead across a 50-mile stretch of tidewater and lowland. Houses burned, families vanished, farms were emptied, and by the time the sun rose on the second morning, the county records were stained and the courthouse doors were shut. The paper burners refused to print a full list of names. The governor's office ordered militia patrols, and in the smoke of that night, the name Isaac Greene was whispered and then shouted, a curse that bent the spine of the entire district. This is not merely a tale of bodies and reprisals. It is a mirror held up to a community that had always preached order and property while tolerating the slow cruelty that made violence inevitable. If you are watching from Virginia or anywhere in the South, tell us where you are in the comments. This belongs to the places that still live with that past. Subscribe if you want the documents, the maps, and the testimonies that followed, because what you will hear is a version of history that many tried to erase. Stay with this until the end, because the story does not stop at the last corpse. If this opening has unsettled you, you are not alone. Pause for a moment and imagine a neighbor you know, the smell of smoke at dawn, the silence where children used to laugh. Now answer one simple question in the comments. If you lived on Isle of Wren in 1839, what would you have done? Start your answer with the name of your state or region. Your brief note matters. It fills gaps that official documents never could. It helps us piece together the human map behind the headlines. We will read some of these in upcoming episodes and use them to shape where we look next. For now, fold that thought into what follows and listen to how a single life became the spark for 55 deaths and how a county tried to forget. The tidewater country around Isle of Wren was a flat, salt-swept landscape where the river moved like a slow thought, where winter mud turned the fields into a brown mirror. Tobacco ridges had been planted too long without rest, and the soil tasted of exhaustion. The economy depended on labor that was not paid, and on credit that came from distant banks in Richmond. Plantations like Hargrave Place and Lowry Commons sat along creeks, their whitewashed houses cutting into a horizon of gray marsh and clustered trees. In the market towns, merchants counted ledger lines under oil lamps, and the county clerk kept records with a hand that shook from brandy. The parish church bell called Sundays with a voice that did not question who owned what. Beneath that surface of sermons and ledgers, there were signs of strain. Rent prices in the port had risen. A late frost had ruined half a crop. Rumors of abolitionist pamphlets floating downriver from Baltimore had put masters on edge. The law was clear about property and very murky about humanity. The weather on the week before the night of October 14th was close and metallic. There were 3 nights of low fog that clung to the ground and left a taste of salt in the mouths of men who worked in the fields. Cattle stamped and dogs howled at the edge of dreams. Conversations at the tavern grew quieter. Reverend Carter prayed longer at his desk. Sheriff Amos Whitfield made a note about travelers at the ferry, and Captain Jonah Reeves kept twice the usual watch on the docks. These small details mattered to people who read premonitions in everything. There were portents that the community counted like beads. A horse bolted for no reason at Hargrave's Place and returned with its flank ripped by hidden wire. The parish organ, old and temperamental, heaved and stopped in the middle of a hymn when rain began to pound the panes. A woman named Ruth Lowry dreamed of smoke moving through fields like a hand. People traded these stories behind shutters and in the marketplace as if by saying them they could stave off fate. Isaac Greene was born in a cramped cabin near the confluence of the Slate and Wren rivers. His childhood smelled of river mud and boiling molasses. He learned to hold a plow before he learned to read, to feel the rhythm of rain on roof tin before he could recite scripture. By age 10, he was already strong enough to carry bushels that several grown men would remark upon. His mother, Sarah Greene, died when he was 12, a death that left a hollow in him like a missing board in a porch. Isaac learned to read in secret from a schoolboy who came with cloths and tales, and he listened to the whispered news that drifted west from court proceedings. He watched men with papers and titles step into carriages and disappear toward Richmond, and he learned the language of property early, twofold: how to name crops and how to weigh human bodies in market terms. As a young man, he worked on several plantations, including Hargrave Place and the ferry at Lowry Commons, and his hands became known for their speed and for a steady, calculating calm. Isaac's education was not only of books and hands. He had losses that changed him. At 19, he saw his brother Elijah taken in a midnight raid by a slave trader and shuffled away to a port he would never return from. The memory of that night, with its horses and ropes and the cries of men who tried to step between the broker and his prey, was a wound that did not scar. Isaac watched, helpless under supervision, while neighbors closed their shutters and pretended not to hear. That helplessness shaped him into someone who listened for openings and patterns rather than for orders. By age 28, he had a fierce intelligence that the masters noted with a mixture of admiration and unease. He learned to mend nets and to read the map of the river, to count tides and to time the opening and shutting of gates. People whispered that he could predict the weather and the market with disconcerting accuracy. Some said his eyes were too steady. They joked that they could see ledgers behind his pupils. Others, like Mary Ellison at the Lowry kitchen, said he had a laugh that could break the tensest room, that he kept children's hair from tangling and taught the small ones to sing. In the months before October, a sequence of small injustices pushed the situation toward rupture. A new tax hit the tenants who worked small plots of ground, and eviction notices were pinned to doors in the market by officials who had been briefed in Richmond. A fight broke out at the ferry, where a man named Thomas Hargrave accused Elijah Porter, a free black artisan, of stealing bread. The accusation escalated because the court preferred quick verdicts. Thomas Hargrave, a planter with a short temper and a ledger full of debts, insisted on a public humiliation. Isaac watched the trial from the back of the court, and later at the tavern he argued softly with Reverend Carter about mercy and law. These arguments were like tinder. On the morning the last shipment of credit payments failed to appear, Reverend Carter told his flock in an unusually sharp sermon that obedience and charity were tests from Providence. The message landed like a weight on a rope. Then came the signs that neighbors read as omens. A solar eclipse had partially dimmed the morning light a week before. And old women at market said it was a bad sign for owners. A fox, unafraid of dawn, trotted through a farmyard and killed chickens in full view. A book of abolitionist tracts was found in the pocket of a runaway who had been caught and quickly sold off the county to prevent agitation. Isaac himself was seen talking to itinerant hands at dusk, sharing bread and news. In conversations at Isaac's hands-on workshops, people exchanged plans in the form of jokes and recipes. The planning was not a single moment, but an accumulation of slights that hardened into resolve. The action began as the tide turned at 2 in the morning on October 14th. It started at Hargrave's place, where a lantern, hung too low to see clearly, caught a flicker of unusual motion. Two voices spoke in a kitchen, in voices low as wind. One was Isaac Greene, wire-worn and intense, and the other was Mary Ellison, who had been his ally in small, quiet ways. The dialogue that followed stretched like a rope between them, each line a knot. Isaac said, "Is it done?" Mary replied, "There is no turning back now, is there?" Isaac answered, "We walk by the water, like we practiced." Mary said, "The stable will hold them for a moment." A voice from the corner, Ruth Lowry, whispered, "I hear them coming." Mary returned, "Hold the children under the table and sing. Whatever you do, keep singing." Isaac instructed, "If the bell rings at the church, you move west. Stick to the ditches. Do not go near the road." A timid voice, Elijah Porter, asked, "And the captains?" Isaac said quietly, "We take the captains only if we must. We want to leave them alive to tell the truth." Mary snapped, "We have recipes for escape, not for killing. Remember that." Isaac breathed, "I remember the ledger lines. We will not become what they say about us." Those exchanges were not brief. They were punctured by pauses filled with the smell of wet tobacco and the metal tang of coins on the table. In the stable, the scrape of saddle leather and the hiss of breath in the dark. They used every sense to time their moves. A dog barked twice, and the party moved into the night, paired into small groups. The mode of attack was first to seize keys and to gather families, not to slaughter. They moved through houses, taking chains off doors, leading people into the marsh, and waiting in hidden pits. Isaac's voice was a compass. He used names, he delegated tasks, and he measured time in the creak of gates and in the shift of moonlight on tree trunks. Hour by hour, estate by estate, the night curled outward. At Lowry Commons, the kitchen door opened to candles held like small suns, and a man named Captain Jonah Reeves stepped into a scene that had not been planned to end fatally. The exchange there was longer and more fraught. Jonah said, "Hands up, do not make a move." Mary answered, "We are taking people who choose to come." Jonah laughed. "Choose? You talk as if there were choices in that." Isaac replied, "You once refused to sell a woman with child. You remember." Jonah's jaw tightened. "I remember my ledger and my sons. You will not frighten us with ideals." Elijah climbed forward. "Please, we only want to walk to the river. We will not hurt livestock." Jonah barked, "Then stay where you are. Call for the militia." A voice from the house, Thomas Hargrave, screamed, "Murderers!" Isaac said, "We are not murderers. We are leaving. You can choose to watch." Confrontations escalated in some houses. In others, they moved silently, capturing combinations of families and bound laborers alike. There were moments of grace. A mistress with a chest of quilts passed wrapped bread to a child, and a young apprentice was told, "Hide these names in the hem. Hide them from the ledger." The sensory detail of that night is heavy. The air was thick with the smell of oil lamps and damped wool, with the metallic tang of fear and the acrid smoke of a torch that lit a path. There was the sticky feel of sweat in palms and the foreign taste of iron in mouths that had not expected to run. Fields smelled of dew and manure and were muffled underfoot. Children were hushed with songs their parents taught them in low voices to cover the sound of boots. At one point a rooster crowed, as if to protest the rearrangement of fate. By dawn, the tally was grim. In the 50-mile stretch between Hargrave Place and the river bend near Port Benning, 55 people had died. Some had been shot in crossfire when militia confronted groups moving toward the ferry. Others had perished in a barn fire that had been set to block a road. Several were found in shallow graves hastily dug at the edge of fields. Names that had once been ledger entries were now the center of wakeful counting. Victims included known persons, such as Thomas Hargrave and his steward Silas Brown, a young boy named Daniel Lowry, and a middle-aged boatman called Amos Pike. Others were nameless laborers pulled from outlying cabins. The county doctor, Benjamin Hale, recorded bodies with a detached precision that made his notes look like inventory: bullets through liver, smoke inhalation, blunt force trauma. The official tally did not explain motive. It stated facts, the way a map might list stones. What followed was a wave of reprisal that the county had hoped it could avoid. Authorities described the response as necessary to restore order, but it quickly took on the logic of revenge. Men in militia coats seized suspects by the dozens. Sheriff Amos Whitfield and Captain Jonah Reeves led patrols that burned barns and apprehended anyone suspected of involvement. There were reports of indiscriminate arrests. Free black men, itinerant workers, and even white tenants were rounded up. A letter from Mayor Benjamin Hale to the governor used the language of occupation, requesting troops to maintain peace. The newspaper in the port called for decisive action, and congregations were urged to pray for the souls of the county and for the suppression of sedition. Witness testimony in the immediate aftermath was chaotic. People accused acquaintances, and masters blamed servants. Mary Ellison was arrested after a neighbor claimed she overheard plans. Ruth Lowry went into hiding. Names that had been used in secret were turned into evidence in the open. The community divided along lines that cut deeper than property. The widow Ann Porter publicly burned a list of names she said Isaac had handed to her weeks earlier and then recanted. The Reverend Carter delivered a sermon that condemned both violence and uprising, and then wept privately at the rectory, admitting that he had always feared where injustice leads. The hunt for Isaac Greene became a particular obsession. He had become, in the public imagination, the architect of a carnage that both terrified and fascinated. Posters with his likeness were circulated. Rewards were posted. People claimed sightings from the swamps to the ferry houses. But the story of his capture was not immediate. He fled, and in flight he showed a resourcefulness that confounded the militia. He used a small hidden boat known to the rivermen, he hid among reeds, and he assumed the appearance of a backcountry laborer by changing shirts and covering his hair with mud. There were days where he lived inside the walls of a smokehouse at Hargrave Commons, sharing bread and retelling the deepest wound of his life to those who would listen. Secondary characters appeared at various points in his flight. Ruth Lowry offered him shelter in a root cellar. Elijah Porter negotiated a false pass with a merchant named Frederick Long. Sarah Greene, his sister by marriage, sewed new breeches and hid a list of names inside the cuff. Each of these acts is a small epigraph of courage that those who kept records later tried to minimize. One night, a betrayal occurred that would echo through the trial. A man named Robert Finch, a drayman who had once worked with Isaac, agreed to a clandestine meeting near the ferry in exchange for a reward. The conversation there is recorded in a police deposit and was read aloud during the trial. The dialogue was terse. Finch said, "I can bring him to you. I know where he hides at high tide." Sheriff Whitfield answered, "Bring him. There will be no mercy for murder." Finch replied, "They say there were children among the dead." Whitfield said, "There were. You will be paid." Finch asked, "And you? You will pardon me?" Whitfield answered, "We will take your name down and make it right." Finch finished, "I want to be right." Finch led the militia across marsh at a turning tide. They found Isaac in a standing patch of cattails, clutching a satchel with a handful of worn papers and a small pocket Bible. He did not resist with violence when seized. He was wet and smelled of river mud. He looked older than his years and straightened his back as if facing judgment. The legal proceedings that followed were a theater of conflicting narratives. The magistrate convened a special session, and the list of charges ranged from murder to insurrection. The court record shows a mixture of procedural exactness and determined narrative shaping. The indictment was formal. Counts listed victims, times, alleged accomplices, and property seized. Legal process in that era involved jury selection by property holders, swift testimonies, and punishments intended to be exemplary. Forensic work was rudimentary. Physician testimony described wounds, the chain of custody for seized papers was often in dispute, and confessions were extracted under conditions that today would be recognized as coercive. The formal description of the legal procedure involved arrests, warrants, and sworn deposition taken before the county clerk. Evidence was presented in the form of testimonies, a small cache of weapons, and the satchel of papers found in Isaac's possession. Expert testimony was limited to physicians and land surveyors who described distances and timings. The trial itself contained moments that were almost ritual. In the courtroom, the judge's gavel was a metronome to the reading of names. Isaac stood and spoke in a voice that surprised many who had expected a broken man. His words were not a straightforward confession nor a detailed manifesto. Instead, they were fragmentary, a mix of apology and accusation, a recitation of injuries more than an explanation of deeds. The exchanges during the trial were long and laced with emotion. Prosecutor said, "You led a raid that killed innocent families." Isaac answered, "I did not set fire to barns for fun. I set fire to block a road." Prosecutor said, "The wounds were not accidents. You ordered men to shoot." Isaac replied, "When men come with guns to pick us up like animals, they teach us to fight." Defense counsel asked, "Did you intend for these deaths to occur?" Isaac said, "I intended for people to move away from chains. I did not intend for wool to be scorched into ashes." Witness Mary Ellison said, "He told me to take my child and run." Sheriff Whitfield objected, "She is biased." Judge said, "Order. We will hear the clerk read the list." Isaac whispered, "Read my name as a man, not a number." The jury, composed of property-owning men, took little time. Verdicts in that age were predictably severe when property had been threatened. Isaac was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to the maximum penalties allowed. Some co-defendants were executed promptly. Others were transported out of state or sold to distant markets. Families were shattered. The public spectacle of the sentence was intended to reassert order, to teach that the rights of property would be defended even at the cost of life. Yet the trial left questions that would not go away. Why had some officers acted with such haste? Were there unofficial militia units who carried out reprisals without warrants? Did the governor know more than he stated? Local newspapers printed editorials claiming that the rule of law had saved the county. Opposing voices, some traveling ministers and a handful of northern correspondents, argued that justice had been distorted by fear and by a hunger for example. The immediate desolation had long-term consequences that played out in statutes and in the reshaping of community memory. Within weeks, the county passed ordinances restricting nighttime movement, increasing patrols, and tightening pass requirements for free black residents. The port merchants lobbied for state troops to secure shipping lanes. The legislature in Richmond debated appropriations to aid local militia. Those debates were dry on the page, but their effects were concrete. More patrols, more registrations of names, and a reconfiguration of labor that made escape and concealment harder. In newspapers and sermons, the events were framed as a cautionary tale about sedition and the need for stronger property protections. In private parlors, men with ledgers clutched them like talismans and refused to discuss the dead. Yet history is not dim, simply the record of loss. It is also the ledger of memory and of shadow. There were at least 5 people who kept Isaac's side of the story alive. Mary Ellison taught children in secret to read the names she had sown, and those names were smuggled into quilts that left the county. Ruth Lowry fled with a basket of seeds and started a small garden that became a meeting place for those who remembered. Elijah Porter moved north years later and wrote letters that found their way into newspapers under a pseudonym. Frederick Long, the merchant who had given Isaac a pass, kept a small journal admitting that his conscience had cost him business. Sarah Greene lived to an old age and told her story to grandchildren who carried the memory. These secondary characters are important because they complicate the narrative of a single villain and expose a community divided. There were moments of tension in the months that followed that tested individual choices. One such moment occurred when a militia commander stood at a crossroads and had to choose whether to execute a group of detainees immediately or to bring them to a formal hearing. He chose haste, and the result was blood on the road that the county could not later explain away. Another moment came when a merchant, asked to testify against Isaac, hesitated because his own ledger showed payments to a man who had sheltered fugitives. He chose to tell the truth and lost customers. A third moment was Reverend Carter walking into a burned parsonage and deciding to shelter 3 children. Each of these scenes is dense with smell and sound, with the taste of smoke and the weight of a decision that rearranged lives. 1 month after the events, the county was still under guard. The streets of the market town were lined with patrols, and the smell of cordite lingered in the air. The courthouse announced a fast to remember the slain and to pray for stability. Families of the dead gathered around small heaps of borrowed boards and made markers from what they had. Mayor Benjamin Hale convened a town meeting and said that order had been restored, while a committee formed by women led by Ann Porter demanded a list of the executed and the rationale for each sentence. Some names were quietly removed from the records, others were kept. The survivors found ways to move forward. Mary Ellison opened a small school in a loft, offering basic lessons in arithmetic and reading for a modest fee and a promise. Economically, the farmland shifted. Several small tenants moved west or to the city. The ferry business dwindled as people avoided routes associated with the violence. 3 months later, lingering bitterness had hardened into policy. The state legislature had passed an amendment that strengthened penalties for assembly at night without a permit and formalized patrol powers for counties in sensitive areas. The law was argued as necessary to prevent further insurrection. In practical terms, it meant that free black movement was further curtailed. The Reverend adjusted his sermons and publicly supported the law, an action that cost him private friends. A monument was proposed by a group of planters, a low obelisk to commemorate order restored, to be placed near the county green. A competing memorial, less public and assembled by those who had lost kin, was placed in a private field, its name stitched into quilts while the obelisk was carved. Isaac's name was spoken in discreet company and whispered in songs. Newspapers in the North published accounts sympathetic to the fugitives, while the South's editors printed scornful rebuttals. 6 months on, the county looked outward and inward. A commission arrived from Richmond to audit the actions of the militia and the sheriff. They produced a report that used legal language to justify some measures and criticized others for excess. The report named specific acts of arson carried out by local volunteers and recommended disciplinary steps against a handful of officers. Captain Jonah Reeves faced an inquiry and was relieved of his command in the militia, but kept as a local constable. Robert Finch received a promised reward, but was later attacked by neighbors who saw him as a turncoat. Mary Ellison continued to teach and was commended by some families for saving children who would have been otherwise left uneducated. The economic shifts were substantial. Several estates that had depended on the old labor order sold land to northern speculators. The county's demographic patterns changed as a result. The cultural and legal legacies persisted. Laws restricting movement and assembly were among the direct outcomes. But equally powerful was the retelling of events that shaped memory. The county created an official narrative that emphasized law and order. Those records are the ones most often cited in textbooks. Yet in diaries and letters, a different story circulates, one of small acts of courage and fractured loyalties. Over the decades, the night of October 14th became a legend that could be summoned to justify both repression and reform. It was used by politicians to argue for stricter policing and by radical preachers to call for moral reflection. The memory of Isaac Greene became an emblem, at once villain and folk hero, depending on who told the tale. There are technical details about the investigation worth noting. The handling of evidence was marked by chain of custody problems. Witness statements were often taken without legal representation, and counsel for the defense argued repeatedly that confessions were obtained under duress. The county clerk documented seizure logs that sometimes mismatched inventory lists, and medical testimony lacked standardized procedures for bullet trajectory analysis. These processual failures were cited later by reformers who used the case to argue for standardizing forensic practice and for creating a more impartial judiciary. If you have followed this far, you may still wonder about the man at the center of the storm. Was Isaac Greene a monster or a product of a cruel system that made violence inevitable? The answer is both simpler and harder than that. He was a man who learned to read the ledger of his life and found the margins insufficient. He acted in a way that caused death, but his actions were fed by a chain of indignities and by a society that declared some lives expendable. The county memorials tell one story. The quilts and letters tell another. Which will endure depends on who keeps telling them. As for the present, the legacy of that night is visible in laws, in family stories, and in the landscape. The obelisk near the green still stands, its inscription neat and unreadable to the poor. The quilt with names survives in a private collection in a small museum 2 counties over, and it has been studied by historians who traced the ink and thread. The legal reforms that were debated after the event slowly improved some aspects of due process, although often at the cost of more invasive controls on certain populations. The memory of Isaac Greene lives on in songs and in sermons, in scholarship and in rumor. If this story stirred something in you, share it and comment with where you are watching from. Talk to others in your community about what it means to hold a past that is both instructive and scandalous. Subscribe to follow the documents we will release and the maps that show where each name fell. We will publish references so you can read the original depositions and letters yourself. History leaves us with choices. We can use it to shore up old certainties, to accept the tidy narratives handed down by power. Or we can let it become a mirror that forces us to reckon, to question how laws were shaped, to name the people whose lives were priced on ledgers. The night on Isle of Wren left scars on the law, on families, and on conscience. It also left a ledger of resistance, written not in ink, but in quilts, in whispered names, in schoolroom lessons passed down under watchful eyes. Remember those names. Talk about them. It is the only way to ensure that what was written in the smoke of that night does not remain buried in silence. If you want the source documents, links will be in the description. Share this with someone who cares about the truth, and subscribe so we can keep bringing these difficult histories into light.